How protests, strikes, and resistance movements succeed. What makes a protest effective? Why do some movements reshape history, while others fade into forgotten headlines? Across the globe, protests and resistance movements have challenged oppressive systems, united people in shared struggles, and sometimes even changed the course of society. Yet behind the chants, sit-ins, and strikes, there's a deeper science of resistance that determines whether a movement thrives or collapses. In this video, we'll explore the anatomy of effective protest through Gene Sharp's groundbreaking framework of 198 methods of nonviolent resistance. Together, we'll uncover universal truths that fuel successful movements by looking at pivotal moments in history: the civil rights movement in the United States, the Arab Spring, and the Hong Kong protests. These examples show that resistance is as much about strategy as it is about courage. Let's dive in. To understand what makes movements successful, we must start with Gene Sharp. Often called the Machiavelli of nonviolence, Sharp's work has inspired countless uprisings and movements worldwide. He believed that power doesn't rest with rulers. It comes from the consent of the people they govern. When enough individuals refuse to comply, that authority begins to crumble. Sharp outlined a powerful framework of resistance in his book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, which includes 198 methods of nonviolent resistance. These methods range from boycotts and sit-ins to strikes and symbolic protests. They represent the diverse tactics activists can utilize to disrupt oppressive systems without resorting to violence. But strategy is key. Nonviolent resistance doesn't succeed purely on good intentions. It requires careful planning, resilience, and the ability to adapt. Let's see how some of these methods played out in three influential movements. The civil rights movement in the United States is one of history's most powerful examples of nonviolent resistance. In the mid-20th century, racial segregation and systemic discrimination dominated American society, robbing Black Americans of basic rights and equality. Yet through organized resistance, change became inevitable. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. anchored the movement in moral conviction. They understood the importance of maintaining a nonviolent philosophy even in the face of brutal violence. Under this guidance, activists employed various tactics aligned with Gene Sharp's methods. The Montgomery bus boycott, triggered by Rosa Parks's historic defiance, became a defining moment. By refusing to use the bus system, African Americans struck a direct economic blow to the structure of segregation. Sit-ins, like those staged at segregated lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, became symbolic acts of defiance, drawing national attention to injustice. Another strategy was mass marches, such as the March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. These protests leveraged the power of visibility, forcing the entire country and the world to confront the moral question of inequality. The outcome? Landmark victories like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 marked the dismantling of legal segregation. More importantly, the movement inspired future resistance efforts everywhere. The success of the civil rights movement shows us that disciplined, highly organized resistance rooted in moral clarity can overcome institutionalized oppression. Fast forward to the early 2010s, and mass protests erupted across the Middle East and North Africa in what became known as the Arab Spring. These movements sought to overthrow corrupt regimes and demand democracy, social justice, and economic reforms. At the heart of this wave of uprisings was the idea of nonviolent resistance and the incredible power of grassroots organization. It all began in Tunisia, when Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor, set himself on fire in protest of police corruption and oppression. His act of defiance ignited massive protests that eventually forced Tunisia's president to flee, marking the start of the Arab Spring. What stands out about these uprisings is the spontaneous, decentralized nature of their organization. Protesters used social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter to mobilize, organize demonstrations, and expose government atrocities. Videos and stories spread across borders, inspiring neighboring countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria to join the call for freedom. In Egypt, Tahrir Square became an iconic symbol of the Arab Spring. Nonviolent protests and sit-ins brought millions together, paralyzing the government and eventually leading to the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak. Strikes, graffiti, and online activism were all part of the resistance toolkit, a modern reflection of Sharp's principles. The Arab Spring underscores two powerful lessons: the importance of grassroots mobilization in galvanizing collective action, and the potential of digital tools to empower resistance. While the outcomes varied across nations, the Arab Spring remains a testament to the transformative power of collective resistance. In recent years, the Hong Kong protests have offered another inspiring case study in nonviolent defiance. From 2019 to 2020, Hong Kongers took to the streets to resist oppressive laws from mainland China, particularly those undermining the city's autonomy and democratic integrity. What's remarkable about the Hong Kong protests is the innovative, decentralized approach of the movement. Under the motto, "Be Water," inspired by martial artist Bruce Lee, the protesters avoided rigid hierarchical leadership. Instead, the movement functioned as a fluid, adaptable force capable of outmaneuvering authorities. The tactics used were incredibly creative. Umbrellas, originally meant to shield protesters from tear gas, became a defining symbol of their struggle. Laser pointers were used to disrupt surveillance cameras and confuse law enforcement. Activists coordinated flash mobs and sit-ins through encrypted messaging apps, ensuring anonymity and security. Protesters also utilized powerful symbolism to capture international attention. Images of people peacefully holding umbrellas under a barrage of police fire resonated worldwide, sparking solidarity movements in other countries. Although the Hong Kong protests faced intense government repression, their legacy is undeniable. They amplified global awareness of authoritarianism and set a new standard for modern resistance through adaptability and strategic innovation. These examples may differ in time, place, and culture, but their lessons for activism today are strikingly similar. When analyzed together, we see clear patterns that form the foundation of effective resistance. Organization and unity. No movement succeeds without solidarity and coordination. Keeping the message unified and maintaining discipline can amplify a movement's strength. Symbolism and visibility. Effective protests capture public attention through strong imagery, memorable slogans, and actions that inspire empathy and support beyond their immediate base. Creative disruption. Movements that succeed reimagine traditional methods to disrupt oppressive systems. Innovation keeps protests dynamic and harder to suppress. Nonviolence as a tool of power. Nonviolent protests create a stark moral contrast between oppressors and resistors, often swaying public opinion and gaining allies. Adapting to circumstances. Resistance movements must be flexible, adjusting their strategies to evolving challenges without losing sight of their ultimate goals. Gene Sharp's 198 Methods of Nonviolent Resistance remains an invaluable guide for activists. His framework reminds us that resistance is not just about fighting oppression, but also about dismantling the mechanisms that sustain it. By refusing to comply, by denying consent, and by disrupting the everyday operations of unjust systems, ordinary people can redefine the balance of power. Whether we look to the bravery of the civil rights movement, the sweeping momentum of the Arab Spring, or the ingenuity of the Hong Kong protests, one truth stands clear. Resistance works. It reminds us that power is not absolute. It is given, and it can be taken away. We live in a world filled with inequality, injustice, and environmental crises that demand action. The same lessons that fueled the victories of the past can shape how we build the future. So the question remains, how will you use these strategies to fight for what matters most? Change happens when ordinary people refuse to accept the status quo. It happens when enough voices unite into action. It happens when resistance becomes more than an idea. It becomes a force. Remember to like and subscribe to be notified when more thought-provoking content drops. And as always, eat the rich.